Some destinies don't arrive with a crown. They arrive shivering beneath the ice, waiting for the one heart brave enough to reach them. The first crack echoed across Blackwater Lake like thunder trapped beneath glass. Clara Whitmore spun toward the sound, her boots sinking into fresh snow as a bitter wind whipped loose strands of her chestnut hair across her pale face. Winter had swallowed the valley for nearly 2 weeks, coating every pine branch in silver and sealing the enormous lake beneath what everyone believed was solid ice. But today, the mountain had other plans. Another sharp crack split the frozen surface, followed by a desperate howl unlike anything Clara had ever heard. It wasn't the cry of an ordinary wolf. It was deeper, older, filled with fear that reached straight into her chest. She ran without thinking. Behind her, villagers shouted for everyone to stay back, but their warnings disappeared beneath the rising wind. As Clara reached the shoreline, the frozen lake erupted into chaos. Massive slabs of ice drifted apart, exposing black water that churned beneath the storm. In the middle of the widening gap, a gigantic white wolf struggled against the freezing current, its enormous paws scraping helplessly against the collapsing ice. It had to weigh well over 400 pounds, far larger than any wolf she had ever imagined. "Leave it," someone yelled from the shore. "Nothing that size survives those waters." Clara barely heard them. The wolf's pale blue eyes found hers across nearly 50 yards of icy water, and for one impossible heartbeat, the fear inside those ancient eyes felt painfully familiar. She grabbed a length of abandoned rope tied to an old fishing sled, wrapped it around her waist, and stepped onto the unstable ice. Every step groaned beneath her weight. The freezing wind stole her breath, and tiny fractures raced beneath her boots like lightning trapped under crystal. She reached the terrified animal just as another section of ice gave way. The water swallowed both of them to their waists. The cold hit like 1,000 needles, stealing every breath from her lungs. The wolf struggled wildly for only a moment before suddenly becoming still, almost as if it understood she was trying to help. "Easy," Clara whispered through chattering teeth. "I've got you." She looped the rope beneath its chest and pulled with everything she had. Every inch felt impossible. Her arms burned. Her shoulders screamed. Slowly, the enormous wolf slid onto thicker ice until it finally reached solid ground. Cheers erupted from the distant shoreline, but Clara didn't have time to answer. Another howl tore through the storm. She looked back toward the broken center of the lake. A second giant wolf was trapped in the freezing water. Then a third. Then another. One by one, enormous shapes emerged from the swirling mist, each fighting the relentless current, each larger than the last. Clara's exhausted heartbeat slowed for only a second before determination replaced fear. If she stopped now, they would never make it home. She tightened the frozen rope in her trembling hands and took another step onto the cracking ice, completely unaware that among the 12 wolves fighting for their lives, the final one carried a secret powerful enough to change her destiny forever. Clara could no longer feel her fingers. The rope had frozen against her palms until it felt like part of her skin, and every breath scraped through her chest like shards of winter air. Still, she leaned forward and reached for the second wolf. It was even larger than the first, its silver fur soaked and heavy, its powerful body barely staying above the water as broken sheets of ice drifted around it. The animal released a low, exhausted whine instead of a growl, and something inside Clara refused to let fear take control. She wrapped the rope beneath its shoulders exactly as she had before and whispered softly, hoping her calm voice would carry more strength than her trembling body. To her surprise, the enormous wolf stopped struggling. Its golden eyes remained fixed on her face, watching every movement as though it had decided to trust the smallest person standing in the middle of the storm. Clara pulled with every ounce of strength she had left. The sled rope stretched tight across the ice while freezing water soaked through her boots. Inch by inch, the giant wolf slid onto firmer ground before collapsing beside the first one, both of them breathing heavily but alive. The people gathered along the shoreline remained frozen in disbelief. Some stared silently while others shook their heads, unable to understand why the wild creatures had not attacked her. An older hunter finally stepped forward, only to stop when another distant howl echoed across the shattered lake. Clara looked toward the sound. 3 more wolves were trapped farther out, separated by widening channels of dark water that reflected the gray afternoon sky. The storm showed no sign of easing. Snow swirled harder with every passing minute, hiding the mountains behind a curtain of white. Someone shouted that the ice would not hold much longer. Another voice begged Clara to come back before she disappeared beneath the freezing surface herself. She closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. She remembered every whispered insult she had endured growing up. Too gentle. Too weak. A useless omega who would never matter to anyone. She had spent years believing those words until this very moment. Standing alone against the winter, she realized kindness had always been the strongest part of her. Without answering the frightened voices behind her, Clara stepped forward once again. The third rescue demanded everything she had. Halfway across the fractured ice, one section shifted beneath her feet, forcing her onto her hands and knees as freezing water splashed across her sleeves. She reached the struggling wolf just before it slipped beneath the surface. Its breathing came in slow, uneven bursts, and its enormous head rested briefly against her shoulder while she secured the rope. The quiet gesture caught her completely off guard. It felt less like fear and more like gratitude. She smiled despite the bitter cold. Together they fought their way back to solid ground, where the waiting wolves slowly stood one after another. None of them fled into the forest. Instead, they remained perfectly still, watching Clara with quiet, unwavering attention. She barely noticed. Her eyes had already found another shape in the distance. Beyond the drifting snow, far larger than all the others, a dark figure struggled alone where the ice had broken apart the widest, and for reasons she could not explain, her heart began beating faster long before she ever reached it. The fourth wolf nearly slipped away before Clara reached it. She dropped to one knee as another sheet of ice drifted apart beneath her, sending freezing water swirling around her legs. The cold climbed higher with every passing minute, stealing the strength from her muscles, yet the frightened animal did not pull away when she touched its thick silver fur. Instead, it lowered its head as if it somehow recognized the quiet promise in her gentle voice. Clara secured the rope beneath its chest and leaned backward with everything she had. Her boots slid across the slick surface until one of the wolves she had already rescued stepped closer to the edge of the ice. It could not cross onto the fragile sheet beneath her, but it planted its enormous paws firmly against the frozen shoreline. The rope stretched between them, giving Clara just enough support to guide the exhausted wolf toward safety. When they finally reached solid ground, she collapsed to one hand, breathing hard while snow settled across her soaked coat. There was no time to rest. Another desperate cry drifted through the storm. The fifth and sixth wolves were trapped together farther from shore where the frozen lake had broken into scattered islands of ice. Clara looked back only once. The villagers still watched from a safe distance. Some appeared frightened. Others simply stared in disbelief. Not one person stepped forward. She understood their fear, yet disappointment settled quietly inside her heart. These magnificent creatures had done nothing except struggle to survive. She tightened the rope around her waist once more and continued alone. Every trip became more dangerous than the last. Sometimes she crawled on her hands and knees across paper-thin ice. Sometimes she waded through waist-deep water before finding another stable path. The wind howled through the valley, carrying snow so thick that the mountains vanished completely behind white clouds. By the time she reached the sixth wolf, her arms shook so badly she could barely tie the knot. Even so, the giant animal remained perfectly still until she finished. One after another, the rescued wolves gathered behind her without making a sound. They did not flee into the forest. They stood together like silent guardians, their watchful eyes following every step she took back onto the lake. Clara noticed something unusual at last. Each time she approached another trapped wolf, the others lifted their heads toward the far end of the shattered lake, almost as though all of them were waiting for someone still hidden beyond the blowing snow. A strange feeling settled over her. These wolves were not acting like strangers brought together by chance. They moved with quiet discipline, watching one another, protecting one another even while exhausted from the freezing water. The seventh rescue ended with Clara nearly losing her balance as a large section of ice drifted away beneath her feet. She caught herself just in time and guided the animal onto thicker ground. Her breathing grew slower. Her vision blurred around the edges from cold and exhaustion. Then the wind shifted for only a brief moment. Through the swirling snow, she saw a single massive silhouette standing almost motionless in the middle of the broken lake. It dwarfed every wolf she had rescued so far. Its midnight-colored fur blended with the storm itself, and although it appeared trapped like the others, there was something undeniably powerful about its quiet presence. Clara did not know why her heart suddenly raced, only that every instinct told her the final journey across the ice would change everything. Clara stared across the shattered lake, measuring the impossible distance that still separated her from the towering shadow beyond the drifting snow. Before she could take another step, a loud voice rose from the shoreline. "That is enough," one of the village elders shouted. "You have already done more than anyone could expect. Come back before the ice claims you too." Several others quickly agreed. Some pleaded with her to return, while others insisted the remaining wolves were simply too large to save. Their fear spread through the crowd like the winter wind, and not a single person moved closer to the frozen water. Clara lowered her eyes for a brief moment. She understood their concern, but every howl that echoed across the lake reminded her that someone was still waiting. She thought about all the times she had stood alone while others decided she was too weak to matter. She remembered carrying heavy baskets through town without anyone offering to help because everyone assumed an Omega should simply endure. Those memories no longer filled her with sadness. Instead, they quietly strengthened her resolve. She lifted the rope once again and continued forward. The eighth wolf was stranded on a drifting slab of ice barely large enough to support its enormous body. As Clara approached, the current slowly carried the floating sheet farther from shore. She stretched as far as she could, lying flat against the ice while extending the rope toward the exhausted animal. For one frightening second, she thought it was too far away. Then the wolf gathered the last of its strength and reached toward her. Their movements met perfectly. Clara secured the rope beneath its front legs and carefully guided the heavy animal back across the shifting ice until both of them reached stable ground. A quiet murmur swept through the people watching from the shore. Even the hunters who had spent their lives tracking wolves could not explain why every rescued animal remained calm beside the young woman. None of them showed the slightest sign of aggression. Instead, they stood in a loose circle around Clara, almost as though they had accepted her into their silent company. She gently rested one trembling hand against the shoulder of the eighth wolf before turning back toward the storm. Snow continued to fall, covering her footprints almost as quickly as she made them. The ninth and 10th wolves were visible only as distant shapes moving through blowing white clouds. Yet something else caught her attention. The largest dark figure had not moved closer to safety even once. The other trapped wolves seemed to position themselves between it and the broken ice whenever the current shifted, almost as if protecting their strongest companion. Despite their own exhaustion, Clara frowned, unable to understand what she was witnessing. The pattern was too deliberate to be an accident. Whatever bound these magnificent creatures together reached far beyond instinct alone. She drew a slow breath, tightened the frozen rope around her waist once more, and stepped deeper into the storm. The cold no longer frightened her nearly as much as the thought of arriving too late, while somewhere beyond the curtain of snow, the silent black wolf raised its head and watched her approach with eyes that carried a quiet intelligence unlike anything she had ever seen. The storm seemed determined to erase every trace of the path Clara had carved across the frozen lake. Snow filled the air so heavily that the shoreline disappeared behind a white curtain, leaving only the sound of the wind and the steady breathing of the wolves she had already saved. She could no longer count how many times she had crossed the broken ice without stopping to think. Her body moved on instinct alone. Every step demanded balance. Every breath demanded courage. The ninth wolf struggled near the edge of a drifting sheet of ice that rocked gently with the current beneath it. Clara eased herself onto the unstable surface, speaking in the same calm voice that had somehow soothed every frightened animal before. The enormous wolf lifted its head, its amber eyes reflecting both exhaustion and trust. It remained perfectly still while she secured the rope beneath its shoulders. When she pulled, the weight nearly sent her sliding into the freezing water, but before she lost her footing, one of the rescued wolves stepped forward on the thicker ice behind her. It leaned its powerful body against the rope, adding just enough support for Clara to guide the stranded wolf safely onto solid ground. She paused only long enough to catch a single breath before turning toward the 10th wolf. By now, every rescued animal stood, facing the center of the shattered lake instead of the forest behind them. Their ears remained alert. Their eyes never wandered. Clara noticed that none of them attempted to leave, even though they were finally free. It was as though they had all made the same silent decision to wait. She followed their gaze and once again found the towering black figure far beyond the broken ice. The distance between them had not changed. The giant wolf remained where it was, surrounded by dark water and floating sheets of ice. Stranger still, the remaining trapped wolves always drifted closer to it whenever the current shifted, almost shielding it without a single growl or command. Clara had never witnessed such discipline among wild creatures. It felt less like instinct and more like unwavering loyalty. She reached the 10th wolf just as another powerful gust swept across the lake. The freezing wind stole her balance for an instant, forcing her to grip the rope with numb hands. The wolf lowered itself without hesitation, allowing her to fasten the rope before she slowly guided it back across the fractured ice. By the time they reached safety, Clara's legs trembled so badly she could barely remain standing. Her soaked coat had become stiff with ice, and every breath formed a cloud that disappeared into the storm. The villagers watched in complete silence now. No one called for her to stop anymore. No one questioned her decision. They simply stared as one impossible rescue followed another. Clara looked across the lake again and quietly counted the figures still trapped beyond the drifting snow. Only 2 remained. One was large enough to challenge every ounce of strength she still possessed. The other was the immense black wolf that had never once called for help, never once struggled against the icy current, and yet somehow commanded the quiet devotion of every other wolf on the lake. Clara tightened the frozen rope around her waist one final time and stepped forward, unaware that the next rescue would uncover a truth hidden beneath the winter storm, a truth that would forever change the life she believed had already been decided for her. Clara forced herself onward until the storm narrowed to a world no larger than the stretch of broken ice beneath her boots. Only 2 wolves remained. The nearer one struggled weakly against the freezing current, its breathing slow and uneven as the floating ice shifted beneath it.
Wait.
Clara gathered what little strength she had left and crossed the final yards with careful, measured steps. The frozen rope felt impossibly heavy in her numb hands, but the familiar routine steadied her racing heart. She spoke softly as she approached, and just like the others, the giant wolf stopped resisting the moment it heard her voice. Trust seemed to flow through the storm more powerfully than fear. She slipped the rope beneath its broad chest, leaned back with every remaining ounce of determination, and slowly guided the exhausted animal toward thicker ice. The journey felt longer than all the others combined. More than once, Clara thought her legs would simply give out beneath her. Yet the wolf continued following her lead without hesitation until both of them finally reached solid ground. As soon as it was safe, the rescued wolf did something unexpected. Instead of resting, it turned immediately toward the center of the shattered lake and lowered its head. Every other wolf mirrored the same quiet gesture. 11 enormous wolves now stood together in complete silence, all facing the lone black figure still surrounded by dark water. Clara followed their gaze. The final wolf had not moved. It remained standing with remarkable composure despite the freezing current pressing against its powerful body. Unlike the others, it never cried out. It never struggled. It simply watched her. Even through the blowing snow, its silver eyes seemed impossibly clear, calm, and ancient. There was an intelligence within them that made Clara hesitate for the first time that afternoon. She could not explain the feelings settling over her heart. It was not fear. It was respect, mixed with an overwhelming certainty that this meeting had somehow been waiting for her long before she was born. The wind roared louder as she stepped onto the last stretch of fractured ice. Every crack beneath her boots echoed across the lake. The black wolf remained perfectly still until she came close enough to reach its shoulder. Only then did it lower its massive head by a few inches, almost as though acknowledging her presence. Clara stared in quiet amazement. The wolf towered above every other one she had rescued. Its midnight coat shimmered beneath the falling snow, and despite the freezing water surrounding it, there was an unmistakable dignity in the way it carried itself. Carefully, she reached forward and rested one trembling hand against its thick fur. The wolf did not pull away. Instead, it closed its eyes for the briefest moment. Clara smiled gently. "You have waited for everyone else," she whispered. "Now it is your turn." She secured the rope beneath its shoulders with slow, deliberate movements. The enormous wolf never resisted. As she tightened the final knot, another powerful crack raced beneath the ice, spreading outward in every direction. Clara looked down just as the frozen surface shifted beneath both of them. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire lake seemed to hold its breath while the silent black wolf met her eyes again, and something deep within those silver eyes told her that this rescue was never simply about surviving the storm. The ice gave one final groan before settling just enough for Clara to pull. She planted both feet, ignored the ache in every muscle, and leaned backward with all the strength she still possessed. The great black wolf did not resist. It moved with calm, measured steps, almost protecting her from the shifting ice instead of thinking about itself. More than once, Clara felt the frozen surface tremble beneath them, but somehow they continued forward together until the wolf's enormous paws reached solid ground. The instant they stood safely beside the others, an unexpected silence settled across the valley. Even the wind seemed to soften. Clara released the rope with shaking hands and stepped back, struggling to catch her breath. Snowflakes drifted gently through the air, landing across the backs of the 12 rescued wolves. Then something extraordinary happened. A warm silver light slowly surrounded the first wolf she had rescued. Clara blinked, wondering if exhaustion had begun to cloud her vision. The light grew brighter. One by one, each giant wolf became surrounded by the same quiet glow. Their massive forms shimmered as though woven from moonlight itself. The villagers along the shore gasped as the towering wolves gradually transformed into men dressed in elegant dark cloaks trimmed with silver, each carrying the calm confidence of an experienced warrior. Clara stared in speechless amazement. 11 strangers now stood where the wolves had been only moments before. Every one of them possessed the unmistakable bearing of powerful alphas, yet instead of speaking, they all turned toward the final figure. The largest silver light remained at the center of the group. It glowed brighter than all the others combined until the enormous black wolf slowly disappeared within its brilliance. As the light faded, a tall man stood in its place. His dark hair stirred gently in the winter breeze, and his pale skin reflected the soft glow of the snow around him. His silver eyes were exactly the same ones that had watched Clara through the storm. Calm, ancient, unshakably kind. The entire shoreline fell completely silent. Without a single command, the 11 alpha warriors lowered themselves onto one knee before him. The movement was so perfectly synchronized that it felt practiced over countless years. The villagers followed almost instinctively, lowering their heads in stunned respect, even though many did not yet understand what they were witnessing. Clara remained standing only because surprise had rooted her in place. The tall stranger looked directly at her. There was no pride in his expression, no anger, only quiet gratitude that seemed deeper than words could express. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps until only a few feet separated them. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady and warm despite the lingering cold. "You crossed the ice 12 times for those you believed were strangers." Clara lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the sudden attention. Anyone would have done the same, she answered softly. A faint smile appeared on the man's face, and several of the kneeling alphas exchanged knowing glances. One of them finally lifted his head and spoke with unmistakable reverence. "My king, the council has searched everywhere for you." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She looked from the kneeling warriors back to the man before her, slowly, realizing that the quiet stranger she had pulled from the freezing lake was not simply another alpha. Without ever knowing it, she had rescued Cale Thornridge, the Alpha King whose name had become legend throughout every pack in the Northern Territories. Clara stood motionless as the realization settled over her like the falling snow. The man before her was the Alpha King whose wisdom and strength had become the subject of stories told across distant valleys, yet only moments ago he had stood silently in freezing water while she treated him no differently than the others. She lowered her gaze, uncertain whether she should bow or apologize, but before she could speak, Cale Thornridge gently shook his head. "Please do not change the way you look at me," he said with a quiet smile. "You saw someone in need before you saw a title. That is a gift far greater than any crown." His words carried across the silent shoreline, reaching every villager gathered near the frozen lake. Many lowered their eyes, remembering how they had begged Clara to abandon the wolves while she alone had continued forward. The 11 alpha warriors slowly rose to their feet, each one looking toward Clara with unmistakable respect. One stepped forward and placed a hand over his heart. "No warrior among us could move while the current trapped our wolf forms beneath the broken ice. We remember every journey you made across the lake. We remember every word of comfort you offered when you believed no one would ever know your name." Another alpha added softly, "You saved 12 lives without asking for anything in return." A heavy silence followed those words. The village elder who had once called Clara too weak to matter stepped forward with slow, uncertain steps. His shoulders no longer carried the confidence they had only an hour before. "We judged you unfairly," he admitted. "We measured strength by power instead of compassion." Several others quietly nodded in agreement. Clara did not answer immediately. She simply looked at the people she had known her entire life and realized anger no longer filled her heart. The storm had washed something away that afternoon, leaving only peace where old wounds had once remained. Cale noticed the gentle expression on her face and understood exactly what it meant. He turned toward the villagers, his calm voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise it. "Remember what happened here today," he said. "The greatest courage did not belong to the strongest body. It belonged to the kindest heart." No one argued. No one looked away. The lesson stood before them more clearly than any speech ever could. Cale then faced Clara once again. Snow rested lightly upon her coat, now stiff with ice after countless journeys across the frozen lake. Without hesitation, he removed the heavy cloak draped across his own shoulders and carefully placed it around hers. The warm fabric shielded her from the bitter wind, and for the first time since stepping onto the ice, Clara felt the cold begin to fade. She looked up in quiet surprise. "You need this more than I do," Cale said gently. Clara smiled, still overwhelmed by everything she had witnessed. Around them, the alpha warriors exchanged quiet glances filled with understanding. None of them spoke the thought forming in their minds, yet each recognized the rare bond already beginning to grow between the compassionate Omega who had expected nothing in return and the Alpha King whose life she had saved. Clara herself remained completely unaware of the deeper meaning behind the warmth she felt whenever their eyes met, believing this extraordinary day had simply come to its peaceful end while destiny, patient as ever, had only just begun revealing its first secret. The storm finally surrendered to silence as the last snowflakes drifted gently across Blackwater Lake, covering the fractured ice with a fresh blanket of white that concealed every dangerous crack beneath it. The valley looked peaceful again, as though the impossible events of the afternoon had been nothing more than a dream carried away by the winter wind. Clara stood quietly with the Alpha King's cloak wrapped around her shoulders, still struggling to understand how an ordinary day had become the turning point of her life. Cale Thornridge stepped beside her and looked across the frozen water where the rescue had begun. The world often remembers victories, he said softly. Very few remember the quiet acts of kindness that make those victories possible. Clara followed his gaze. I only did what felt right. Cale smiled, and there was genuine admiration in his silver eyes. That is exactly why it mattered. Behind them, the 11 Alpha Warriors prepared the large traveling sleds that had finally reached the village after searching through the mountains. None of them carried themselves with the pride Clara expected from legendary warriors. Instead, each one stopped before leaving and offered her a respectful nod. Several villagers who had once overlooked her now approached with warm blankets, hot tea, and quiet words of gratitude. Clara accepted every gesture with the same gentle smile she had always carried, never asking for recognition, never reminding anyone how differently they had treated her only hours before. Her kindness remained unchanged because it had never depended upon the opinions of others. As twilight settled over the valley, the clouds slowly parted. Moonlight spilled across the snow, transforming the frozen landscape into a field of silver. Cale extended his hand toward Clara. Will you allow us to escort you home? She hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His touch felt warm despite the winter air, and for an instant an unfamiliar feeling settled quietly between them, calm and comforting, like the first light appearing before dawn. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them understood why the moment felt so significant. They simply walked together toward the waiting sled while the Alpha Warriors followed a respectful distance behind. Before climbing aboard, Cale paused and looked back at the lake one final time. His thoughtful expression revealed that his mind had already moved beyond the rescue itself. There is one question that still remains, he said quietly. Clara tilted her head. What question? His eyes returned to the distant mountains rising beyond the valley. 12 alpha wolves do not become trapped beneath broken ice by chance. The words lingered in the cold evening air. Clara followed his gaze toward the dark peaks, where the forest stood silent beneath the moonlight. She had been so focused on saving lives that she had never stopped to wonder how such an extraordinary disaster had happened in the first place. A gentle breeze stirred the snow across the frozen lake, erasing the final traces of the day's struggle. Clara drew the warm cloak closer around her shoulders and looked toward the mountains with quiet determination. Whatever mystery waited beyond those ancient forests, she knew one thing with complete certainty. Courage had carried her across the ice once before, and if destiny called again, she would answer without hesitation, never imagining that the greatest journey of her life had only just begun.